Good morning, truth seekers. Of course, the moment I hit go live, like some stupid pop-up show, like alert shows up on my screen and I have to read what it says. Good morning, truth seekers. Welcome to Coffee with Calvin, the place to get wiser about yourself and the world. Today, I've got a very special guest. I've got Mary Shores with me right here not in the studio, but live on the air. Mary, welcome. I'm really glad to have you.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Calvin. Good morning.
Good morning. You got your coffee?
I have it. Well, I have 3 cups, so I'm ready to go.
You have 3 cups of coffee or 3 cups?
Well, I have 1 cup of coffee, and then I have 2 cups of like hot water with lemon because my voice is a little hoarse. Hot water with lemon and honey.
Nice. All right. That sounds great. Well, raise your cup, everybody, and let's share a sip. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. All right, so Mary is the author of a book called Conscious Communication, which on Hay House, which is really cool. Like, who doesn't want to be published on Hay House? If you're a little weird, like I am, like we are. So amazing! Congratulations on that. That in itself is quite a feat.
It was definitely a dream come true because that was my dream publisher, and for like so many years I had talked about and wanted to write a book, but I always said that I want to write a book, but I'm not a writer. And it's just such a great metaphor for how words are a mirror to our subconscious programming, because when you hear me say those words, I want to write a book, it's like you can see that written on my soul that I have this purpose to write this book. But I have a big problem when the next words out of my mouth are, but I'm not a writer. Right. Because that is revealing some sort of hidden subconscious belief system that deep down I really don't believe, or I didn't really believe that I could actually accomplish, or that I was actually capable of writing. So before I was going to do anything, I had to rewrite that belief system.
There you go. And you did end up writing it yourself, right? No ghost
I did.
Yeah.
No, yeah, I definitely got the book done, and I had, in order to change that belief, I just invested in myself by going to some writers' workshops.
Mm-hmm. But apart from writer workshops, you had to be willing to do that work, right? Because I see a lot of people who will go on workshops or seminars, but they're not really doing the inner work. So they keep being like, I hope someone else will take care of that for me because I really don't want to look at that inside. Mm-hmm. Do you see that?
I think we're always molding and shaping our inner landscape of our subconscious, and that there's so many things that we don't understand. So we can either be working on clearing some things out and like creating it the way that we want to create it, because ultimately we have certain things that we're in control of that allow us to create our realities, or we're not, and we're just ignoring what our barrier beliefs are. We're not really working on those things, and life's still going to happen. You're still going to create all those things, but maybe you have less control over the outcomes. Mm-hmm. So I think we're always doing some sort of inner work. It's just whether it's purposeful or not.
That's a good point. I have my aunt who just passed away at age, I forget, like 87 or something like that. My mom told me how my mom and her would go to these clairvoyants every once in a while. And they would go like one after the other to see this person, and then my aunt would always be like, my mom would be like, hey, what did he say? What was it? What did he tell you? And she was like, they all say the same thing. I don't want to do that. And she never revealed what that was, but she was just like, I guess she kept going hoping for a different answer or something.
That's so crazy. I want to know what they told her.
I know, me too. Like, no, she's gone now. Nobody will ever know. She never told. She really.
It shall remain a mystery.
Yes, yeah. So you founded a collection agency.
I do. I still own it today.
And so tell me how, like, what does that look like in practice?
First of all, for the audience, I just want to acknowledge right up front that debt collectors, definitely there's a negative stigma to debt collections, and there's a reason for that, because historically debt collectors have behaved in a way that really triggers people, and they've used a lot of shaming, intimidation, and punitive consequences in order to collect debt. And so I had an opportunity to have my own business when I was 24. I always, always, always wanted to have my own business. When I was a little girl and all the other little girls would play house, I would play bank. So there was something definitely like bank. That was my game, bank. And I made a bank in my garage. We had a 2-car garage in the Midwest. And I made all this fake money, and I had like accounts, and all the little kids would come through my bank on their tricycles or big wheels or bicycles or whatever they had, and they would have accounts at the bank so that they could go home and play house, but they had to come to my bank first. Wow. So there's just something in my DNA. So cool. That I just came here to definitely own businesses and be involved in the business world, and just very driven type of person. So when I was 24, I got an opportunity to own a collection agency because someone in my family, it was a family business. They were going out. They had all kinds of financial trouble, ironically, owning a debt collection company. And that gave me an opportunity to go to some of these clients and get my start. But right away from the beginning, I didn't want to do debt collections the quote unquote nasty way. So I decided that I wanted to use sales as my approach. And you would think that sales would be a decent approach for debt collections, and you'd think it would work, but it actually failed miserably. It failed. And it failed for 2 major reasons. And the first reason it failed is because that, in all businesses you have competition. And so my competition was the other debt collectors, because typically when someone owes a debt,
they'll owe multiple.
They owe multiple debts, right?
That makes sense.
So my competition was the other debt collectors. And the other debt collectors were using fear-based tactics in order to collect. Well, humans, we all have the same operating system in our minds. Well, let's say 90% of people have we're wired in generally the same way. And so we're wired for this thing called negativity bias. And negativity bias means that we're going to have a stronger reaction to negative stimuli, more so than if we were to measure the positive reaction we have to positive stimuli, right? So that's survival. We're wired for negativity bias because back when we used to live in the wild, we really needed to be on alert for things like saber-toothed tigers or whatever could attack us. And I apologize to the audience. Someone outside my window is mowing the lawn. It's so annoying. It'll stop in a few minutes. So because we're wired that way, I was always losing out to these like big, mean, nasty debt collectors. And then the second reason it failed, I learned this later, but the second reason it failed is because the sales tactic, the sales strategy didn't address the real issue, and the real issue was the shame and unworthiness that people feel just by having a debt.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah.
Yes. So super early on in my career, I developed a communication strategy that I call Words That Work. And this is just all about helping people feel good about paying a debt, because having a debt is a psychological burden. And it's a burden that will literally build a brick wall in between people and living the life of their dreams. So if someone has a debt, they're less likely to apply for the same job, even date the same person, or apply for a mortgage, because they're going to have a belief system about themselves. So I just developed this communication strategy that helped people get around that really got them out of being triggered over the debt and wanted them to feel good about the fact that they were paying it. And so that changed everything in my business.
That's super interesting. I think that sounds extremely powerful, right? Because really, of course, you could theoretically forgive their debt and just be like, forget it, you don't have to pay it, right? Obviously, not your business. Or I don't know how it works. Do you collect the debt on behalf of someone else?
Right.
Or
so
is
I
it
couldn't
factoring or?
I
You buy
couldn't
the
forgive
debt.
the debt because I don't own it.
Right.
The debt is on behalf of my clients, and
Right.
it's so
But
interesting.
my point was like, even if you could, that wouldn't actually serve them, right? Because like the integrity and that confidence and good feeling and closing that loop comes from actually paying it off.
So I think you're right, but I think that in a perfect world, yes, there's integrity, and there's, we know it's the right thing to do to pay off the debt. The reality of the situation is there are people that no matter how much they try, they're not going to be able to pay off the debt. So a lot of times when I teach workshops have my clients' offices, and it might be a large hotel or something, or excuse me, a large hospital, I'll go in and I'll take that turnip, that metaphorical turnip, and I'll say, okay, squeeze the blood out of this. Because the reality is, if there's just nothing to give, people can't give what they don't have. People can only do what they can do, and they can't do any more than that. Now, we can help them maybe make some better decisions, like, hey, if they're going to McDonald's every day or buying cigarettes and beer, that's a different type of situation. But at the end of the day, the best way I can serve them is to help them understand that they're not a bad human being because they owe money. Owing money we should have a healthy relationship with debt. We should see debt as something that we're investing in ourselves and not something that ruins our lives. And that's just like a fundamental belief system that I have. And people, if they are in over their heads, we have a system where they can file bankruptcy, and that's not necessarily a wrong thing to do. That psychological burden of debt exists on both sides of things, because just yesterday I was having a conversation with one of my clients, and it's a dentist office, and like the burden they feel is not being able to pay their own bills because their patients aren't paying them.
Right, and they have already incurred the costs of treating this patient or whatever it is. And
that's absolutely right.
People,
yes.
And all that. Yeah.
And equipment and things.
Right. Yeah. I've had debt myself, and like at one point we were doing a startup and we'd only capitalized it by so much, and we'd run out of money, and we had a designer who we hadn't paid, and we're like, oh, we don't have more money. Can you like wait? And he was like, the clincher for me was like, basically when he wrote, "I'm not your bank." So I'm like, you know what? You're right. We got to figure this out. Like, I've got to pay it out of my own pocket or whatever, like something, right? But also, like, my experience was I had debt where at one point I went through like life crisis stuff, right? Divorce and things like that. But even before that, there were things that were happening. So building up debt, and then the minute I was reading like something, I think it was Gay Hendricks. He's also a Hay House author sometimes, at least, about integrity, and like just that point of beginning to pay down the debt, even though like at that point it was a stretch for me, and just a little bit every month. But that making the decision and then starting to move on that really felt like it made a difference, both in terms of how I felt about myself and how I felt about my debt and how I was doing, but also it feels like that was a turning point in terms of actually turning everything around, right?
So let's talk about like that moment right there. Okay, so it sounds to me that there was a time in your life when, and we've had these sort of dark nights of the soul, if you will, where things aren't going our way. We're going through a stressful time period. I certainly did as well. Like for the 2 years after my divorce, I was basically a functioning catatonic. I thought I was going to lose everything financially. I thought I was going to become disease ridden. I really had this very negative outlook for my future, right? But when you're in that moment of being inspired, it sounds like Gay Hendricks inspired you. You probably were getting inspiration from other sources as well. But there was a moment in time when you made a decision that integrity was important to you and you were going to figure out a way. Now imagine that you have that moment and then you call up whoever you owe the money to, and now they just treat you like crap.
Right.
After because So think about that. You like well up the courage to be like, I'm going to handle this. Now you've got to make some phone calls. And if you call the place and they just treat you like crap, you've got a really great potential of allowing that to put you right back down where you were at in the first place.
Got it. Yeah.
You know, to like, oh, you know what? I'm wanting to take care of this. These people aren't wanting to work with me. And that's part of the problem about debt, is how it just keeps people down. And so good for you that you were able to step up. Good for you that you were able to like tap into that integrity. And, the other part of this is like understanding the basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, so basic Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that bottom rung is things like food, water, shelter, clothing, right?
I put on some aircon. I never put on aircon, but this city is
I was like, is that
point.
like an old dinosaur computer system, or is it some sort of air? I was looking at that, like, what is that?
It's an old dinosaur computer system called an air conditioner. Yeah, it's pretty much.
So what happens? You just like hit the on button and it
should start at some point, but it makes this like loud humming noise. I'm like, it's 2018. Can't we do better than this? It's nuts, but apparently not.
We'll just pretend we're in an airplane between the air conditioner and the lawnmower.
I know. It's got to be what it is, but like, holy, this is too much for me.
So those people. So imagine that you're in that spot,
right.
and you've got 3 kids. Well, you're going to have to choose to feed those kids, clothe those kids, and meet those children's basic needs before you can think about paying some debt from 2 years ago. You know what I mean?
Right.
So like the place that I need to work is within those parameters of being able to sort out the person who's in the position at all to have anything to pay, which I think you were, or those people who actually it's going to harm them by trying to pay the.
So what do you do in those situations?
Well, that's a really good question. So I have found it to be way more profitable and way more humane, because I think that we need to bring humanity into, like it's so dehumanizing the way that some of the debt collectors behave. So what I'm saying is, I want to invest in my resources in those people who are in that position you're in. And then if I identify that this other person is not in that position, then it really just makes no sense to be chasing, why chase them down?
Right. But you then like put a pin in it and come back to them 6 months later to see if it's better? Do you like help them maybe, because like you would think that they're like, again, with the right mental, it's not your job, but like over time they would be able to get to a better situation, or you just drop it, just mark that.
Well, it's not necessarily. I like the expression of put a pin in it, because what we're going to do is it's going to be on their credit report. So if they do get in a better position financially later on down the road and they go to purchase something, well, then they're going to see a list of things that they need to take care of before they can make that purchase. But the reality is, me calling them every 6 months, their situation is not going to change in 6 months' time. So leaving it upon those people to contact us is the better the better situation, and it's really our communication strategy that was behind all of the success we had, because once we developed that communication strategy, our revenue went up 34%. So it's really catching those people who have the ability and maybe just need a strategy
revenue,
to work.
do you mean the debt collected, or is that some other metric? Yeah, okay. Just to be clear. So all right, so you separate people, you divide people into like those that are basically you're not going to try to do something here, and then the people that you can work with. And then what I heard you say is like the number one thing is like help people not feel bad about themselves, because that's not helping.
Right.
And then what?
Well, I mean, then you just work it out. They'll either want to pay it right away because they want to preserve their credit report, or they want to work out some sort of payment arrangement. It's not really rocket science, and it's just working it out, a system of negotiation that's designed to fit their needs and get the bill paid. But it's just like I think the interesting point here is doing it in a way that is not dehumanizing to the person who owes money, because my philosophy at the end of the day, money is a made-up thing. It's not even real.
Right.
It's not even, it's so, I don't know, dumb, like, is a word that constantly comes up to me. I mean, like, think about it. When we're kids, we play Monopoly, right? And we play Monopoly, and it's all fake money, and it's just such a great metaphor for our adult lives, because it's essentially what we're doing is we're like working to gain all this money to give it away to all of these other people, and it's all just this made up thing. Right. And what I find really interesting is, what is the only way to win Monopoly?
Everybody else is gone.
You have to bankrupt all your friends.
Right. Yeah.
And like growing up in the 80s, I mean, that was kind of the thing.
It feels shitty. B, it's lonely. Like there's no one left. Like you can't play. It's not fun. Yeah.
Right, and then you win the game, and then you start over. But it was like having all that power, right? Like you had to, in order to gain all that power, you had to buy the more expensive properties, and you had to bankrupt all your friends. And I feel like that's such a great metaphor for business in the 80s and in the 90s, right? And now we're kind of going through this paradigm shift where we're really looking for, especially like people in the millennial generation, and I really believe like the upcoming generation Z, it's going to be all about humanitarian plus focused companies and business.
When I play Monopoly with my daughter, she's 13, she pretty much always wins. She, for whatever reason, she's very good at it, and then she's like, oh, here, you have this property. Here, let me give you some money. It's just like she's not interested in winning at all. She just plays very well.
and we could all be winners that way, right? Because we can all share and have our needs met.
Yeah.
Keep the game going.
Louis C.K., have you seen his sketch on Monopoly?
I haven't. I'll have to look it up.
There's a sketch where he's playing with his, like, what's going to happen now is I take all of your money and all of your property belongs to me, and then I'm going to take that and use it to crush your little brother.
That's so true. I love it.
Yeah. It's really funny.
I love it.
Have you read the book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years?
No.
It's really interesting. I think you would find it very fascinating. So I think his name is David Graeber or something. But basically he's saying this idea, we're being told that before there was money, there was barter. That then people would trade, I have a cow, you have some shoes, let's swap or whatever. He's like, that never happened. That never happened. Historically, if you look back at it, that never happened. The only societies in which barter ever happens are societies that used to have money, but now for whatever reason don't have money, like concentration camps or Argentina or something like that. What did happen were debt. So monasteries like 5,000 years ago, they would have like keep track of basically spreadsheets, right, on paper or whatever technology they were using to keep track of, like, oh, you put in this much work, that's worth like a quarter of a cow, or like measured in rice grains or whatever the unit of measure was. But that didn't mean that rice grains or cows ever changed hands. It was just a unit of accounting. And so this idea of debt actually traces back, millennia, whereas money as like a thing, like a dollar bill and that kind of thing, does not. I found that interesting. And this also this like psychological thing of like, well, you have to pay your debts, otherwise you're a bad person. That is something that dates back a long time as well, and is very ingrained in us. Even though like sometimes it's crazy, like, Goldman Sachs will make a loan to some tyrant in Africa who then like takes all that money and like stashes it somewhere and disappears, and then now the country, the entire population of the nation is saddled with this debt, and is like, well, you have to pay your debt. Well, the person your situation is different, right? Because you're not you don't represent banks, but in terms of banks, like the idea is that you make a loan and you charge interest is that there's a risk involved. And so obviously, yeah, people cannot pay their debt. That's kind of built into the system from the start.
Yeah, that's interesting, and especially this. I'm really, when I was a kid, the other thing I wanted to be was an anthropologist. So always super interested in ancient cultures, ancient civilization, ancient ways of doing things, and especially the really old spiritual practices, belief systems, and where that where that all came from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he talks about like when tribes would meet and trade with each other. Like within each tribe, you basically have socialism, right? Like within each family today, we have socialism. I don't count how much my daughter chips in and like whatever. Like that's not how it works. But then you have these tribes that would meet, and then they would have these like rituals that would take sometimes several days, involving like dances and shows, fake shows of aggression and like, I want the thing, and then like, oh no, it's really nothing, it's not worth anything, and then they would like take it and rip it out of the hand of the person that was part of the ritual. They would like have sex across the tribes, and like, now I've taken your spear, I'm gonna penetrate your wife.
I want to go live there. That sounds fun.
It sounds really fun. Like trade is so boring these days, right? You just go to Starbucks and you show your app, and then like, what's fun in that, Yeah.
I don't know, but now I want some Starbucks.
So what? Bringing this up at like a more societal level, like given what you've learned about psychology, like even like in your book, you talk more about creating your life through words, right? That your self-talk really determines your possibilities. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I was saying, I developed this communication strategy, and I started training on it. And then people that were taking my business trainings were saying, hey Mary, like this doesn't just change my business, this changes my life. And I got the opportunity to publish with Hay House, and I really needed to take this into a broader perspective. And I feel like here you go. Total synchronistic story of how the universe provides. So I'm like, I'm really, I've got this dream. I want to publish this book. I want to do it with Hay House. I've got an opportunity to submit a proposal to them, because I went to one of their writers' workshops where you get that opportunity to send them a proposal. So then from there, I'm like, well, I realized that Hay House is not going to publish a business book. Like that's just not their genre. So I thought I really need to change this into something more spiritual and personal development. Now, I had this secret desire for a very long time to be a motivational speaker. And I was actually, whenever I was teaching my workshops, my Words That Work workshops, I was actually teaching law of attraction. So I was going in there, but I was never saying law of attraction, and I was never telling people what I was doing. But what I was doing is I was teaching them my spiritual beliefs through this business workshop. And it was working, because people were coming to me and they're like, hey, this is changing my life. Like this is really huge. So I put out this intention that I wanted to have this book, and I go on this meditation retreat in Faber, Virginia, this place called Monroe Institute. Now, this place is a trippy place, and I'm into trippy things. Like, I'm this girl that ever since, I don't know, I was very, very young, I was chasing mystical experiences. And I would be that kid that wanted to sit in the backyard because I actually wanted the aliens to land and abduct me, but they never did. So I'm like, why don't you pick me? Like, why don't you want to pick me? You could have my eggs. Like, let's make a hybrid baby together or something weird like that. Anyway, it just never happened for me, and I would always be super disappointed. Anyway, half of that is obviously a joke, but I did seek out how to figure out how to have a mystical experience, because it seemed to me that people in ancient times, it's very clear to me through their art, through the things that they were saying, that they're having these mystical experiences. They were talking to God. That was not an uncommon thing. Now if you're talking to God, that's weird, unless you're Neil Donald Walsh, who gets to have conversations with God. But that's not everybody gets to do that. So I go on this meditation retreat at this place called Monroe Institute. And Bob Monroe, he is the person who created the technology that we now know as binaural beats. So it's when you meditate to headphones, and they'll put one frequency in one ear and one frequency in the other ear, and the imbalance of the frequencies causes the brain waves to balance in whatever, alpha, beta, theta, gamma state. Actually, gamma is hard to reach. Yeah. Anyway,
I actually developed a little tool to generate these just for fun, so I could make my own binaural meditations. Yeah.
So that's incredible. So Bob, back in the 40s, was working on the the original technology to make that happen. And the reason that he came up with that is because when he was 40 years old, he started having spontaneous out-of-body experiences. Well, he didn't understand what was happening, so he went to like a psychiatrist, and he went to a neurologist, and he thought he was schizophrenic. So he thought there was literally something wrong with him. But as it turns out, he found this psychiatrist that actually knew a little bit about more the spiritual aspect of what was happening to him. So he really wanted to study this, and he hooked himself up to EEGs, and he essentially reverse engineered his brainwaves into these binaural beats, which is now like you're able to do that. So I went to his institute, and when you go there, you spend a week in meditation, but you're not sitting there like kumbaya. They have these units, they're called check units, and they're like holistic chambers that are designed for like, I guess it's designed to be a chamber where you don't have outside distractions. So it's totally dark, like you can't tell whether you have your eyes opened or closed. And you listen to the stuff comes in through the wall, you plug your headphones into the wall, and then you've got the binaural beats going on. So I go to this place. Well, I end up meeting this guy named Will Harris. And Will Harris is like the Tony Robbins of India. Like this guy, he just blew my mind. He goes to India. He has 1 million people that show up at his speeches in India. Well, it turns out that Will Harris and I have the same birthday. So, which is October 30th. And Will is like, okay, you're my twin sister, and we have all these parallels in our lives. Like, we're both public speakers. We're both like on a mission. We're both writers. And like, we're like, that's really cool. So he says to me, hey, Mary, I'm giving this speech in New York, in Lilydale, New York, and I want you to come with me, and you can just like teach the workshop with me. So I'm like, cool. I'll do it. Like, I'll show up for that. I'll do it. And then he says, well, you can't come to Lilydale and teach a speech about business because Lilydale is the oldest spiritualist community in the country. Now, what that means is you have to talk to dead people to live at Lilydale. Like, you talk about a girl looking for a trippy experience. Lilydale, New York is very trippy because all of these people, they're all psychic mediums. So Will is like, hey, if you want to come give this speech, it needs to be something like, how can you see Jesus like in your butter? I'm like, okay. So I take my words that work, I cross it out, I write law of attraction on the top, and I just change the whole thing. And then I recorded my workshop. It was 4 hours. I recorded it, and I worked with an editor to mold that into a book proposal, submitted it to Hay House, and got a book deal. But all of these things, here's my point of this big, long story that involves like ghosts and mountains and meditation and all of this stuff. All of this is the universe leading me on a path, right? So the day that I heard Bob Monroe or someone talking about Bob Monroe, I think it was on like Coast to Coast with George Norrie, hear that interview, immediately become intrigued, look up Bob Monroe, buy all of his books. I was so infatuated with Mr. Monroe that I read all of his books in like 3 weeks, which for me is really fast. Then I immediately booked myself a trip. And you know that guy, Evan Alexander, that wrote the book Proof of Heaven, and he's the neurosurgeon that had the near-death experience. So he goes to Monroe too. So like he mentions Monroe Institute in his books as well. But see, like I had to hear Bob's name. Then I had to read Bob's books. Then I had to go to Monroe Institute. I had to meet Will, who has my same birthday, for him to invite me to New York so that I would give that speech, so that I would write that proposal, so that I would get my book deal. And so, okay, what is the book about? The book is about how and why we create our own reality. And it's doing it in a way where I wanted to prove that concepts like this are real, but instead of calling it this like woo-woo law of attraction, which most people don't understand anyway, and it's just super trendy, but I wanted to explain it through neuroscience. So it's like taking all of these concepts, these woo-woo concepts, and saying like, here is how and why we're actually creating our reality, and it has everything to do with the way that our brain is structured and built and the way that it functions. And when you do that, you can easily see that science and spirituality are talking about the same thing, but they're using two different languages. So there you have it.
All right, that makes sense to me. That makes sense to me. It sounded really amazing. And this story is like makes me a little envious, but that's cool. So now you've just upped the bar for what I want to set as my intention here. So pulling that up at a societal level, what does that mean for, like, obviously with politics, right? We're trying to make the world better for a lot of people, like whether it's say people who poor people in this country, right? So given what you know, what would be the best way to, we've had a war on poverty and like handing out trillions of dollars of welfare, and it doesn't seem to really be moving the needle on poverty in this country. So what would be a better approach given what you know?
Okay, so I may not have the most popular position on this. I consider myself to be a libertarian. Uh-huh. And I was on welfare when I was young. Mm-hmm. So when I was out on my own at 16 years old. Mm-hmm. And I would say that through circumstances that were no fault of my own at 16, my mother was a bit unstable. I just had nowhere to live. So I was out on my own. By the time I was 19, I became pregnant. I graduated high school. I had this child. She was born severely brain damaged. And so it was so bad to the point where she was blind, she was deaf, she was unable to suck a bottle, she was unable to swallow, so she had a gastrostomy tube inserted into her stomach, and she was on life support for the first days of her life, and she would have surgery after surgery. And my life, as well as my partner's life in those days, we literally had zero resources, we had zero guidance. We were kids, we were like juveniles trying to make it in an adult world. Now Haley lived for a year and a half, and a lot of that time for her, my baby daddy and I, was spent living in and out of the children's hospital, which meant things like we slept on the emergency room floor. We were meeting other families in these disastrous situations. But my financial situation, I had no hope. I mean, I had nothing. And her medical bills were millions of dollars. Mm. The cost of this. And I also, there was no choice. The medical machine was just going to work, and I had no decision. It's not like I just didn't understand these things at 19 years old. And so I was on welfare, the whole thing. Like, she had a medical card, we had food stamps, there was money given to us. And I feel like for all intents and purposes, I should have become a statistic. Right? But instead, I turned around, started my first business at 24, became very successful, and now all these years later, I've collected $40 million. But, so what's the difference? What's the difference between me and that person that never reaches any kind of goal in life? And what I can tell you, when I was in the system, when I was on welfare, that what I would see is a generational issue. Right? So like people on welfare, their parents, their grandparents, it's just a cycle it's just a cycle. And those people, their mindset is one of, how can I get the maximum benefits with the least amount of effort? Mm-hmm. So as welfare might go about changing the rules, which they often try to change the rules, right? And then nothing works. Those people stay one step ahead by learning a strategy to get around the rules. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not saying that they're purposely having more kids, because I don't believe that. But what I do believe is that maybe they're not the best at making choices for their life. Like maybe they're making a little bit more irresponsible choices. Mm-hmm. But I don't think they do it on purpose to like get more money or get more benefits. So I think that in order to fix it, there was some experiments. I don't remember what decade it was. I want to say was still in the 1900s, where these scientists took in several inner city children from the time they were born, and they educated these children. They gave them like they gave them like the same education that a wealthy white person would have, so have you. And then they followed these people throughout their lives, and they all became like master's degrees or PhDs, and so that early intervention was the key. Mm-hmm. So see, we try to solve the problem from a political standpoint of changing the rules, but if that same amount of budget was put into putting these kids maybe in like a Steiner school or a charter school, or investing in how they use their mind and how they develop their mindset, that's the only thing that can really make change for that particular population. Okay, but here is another thing that I want to say about this is, like, if you understand the concept of collective conscious, that, I mean, do you understand that concept? Mm-hmm. Have you heard of the 100th monkey?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, so in the 100th monkey concept, we've got these monkeys off the coast of Japan. And these monkeys are given, you can correct me if I get any part of this story wrong. These monkeys are eating these sweet potatoes. And the sweet potatoes are covered in sand, and the monkeys don't like the sand on their food. So the younger monkeys figure out how to wash the sand off of the potatoes. And then they start teaching their mothers, and the idea spreads throughout this population of monkeys. Well, then what happens, which was a surprise to the scientists watching this, is that monkeys on the other island that had no connection whatsoever started to wash their potatoes. So how did they get that? It's not like they learned it, they just started doing it. So it's this idea that there's a collective consciousness, and they've already done the experiments in humans to prove that we as well have some sort of collective conscious grid. Now, I heard, and I don't know if I heard it on like a podcast or whatever, that it's 4%. We need 4% of people to have a certain belief, and then it catches on to that collective conscious and the idea spreads. So like what we really need to do is focus on changing our mindset, and collectively as a species, make some decisions, grow some beliefs, and honestly right now I feel like the most important thing is how are we going to collectively figure out how to heal the earth. You know, the earth is in such a state of pollution, of we're essentially killing the rainforest, which is the lungs of our planet, and no one is really educated on that in school. So you've got like the human problem, which is this poverty, this mindset, this people that are generationally in the welfare system. Then you've got this bigger problem, which is what I think that needs to be the focus on, is how are we healing the earth? And then somehow, and I'm not really sure how because I'm not smart enough to say that there is a commonality between both of these things, and it is the root of money and power. And there's a tie-in on both sides of this.
The roots of money and power. So, yeah, explain that a little bit.
I have no idea how to explain it. I'm just like, I need another cup of coffee for that, Calvin. Tell me what you think, and then I'll...
So, I love that you bring the collective conscious into it. Like, so my... I love that you've said you're a libertarian. I think that's definitely where I'm leaning as well. It seems to me that, like, in your case, there's just like with your daughter and all that, there's just like no way that you are gonna make that on your own, right? There's always gonna be people where it's just like, all right, we gotta help you over this hump right now. It seems to me that having that help come from the government is usually the least effective way, right? Because that's just a machine. If it's some kind of local community group, ideally something where you look people in the eye and they're like, hey, we're going to help you. It's not just money. We're there. We're spending time. We're helping care for you, whatever. We'll get you on your feet. But that the goal is to get you on your feet, not to just like pay some bills right now. That seems to me to be like what we need. And like change doesn't happen in people's lives until their mindset changes, right?
Right, that's right. So I think that what I'm saying is the investment needs to be made in the mindset.
Exactly.
I mean, that's the change that needs to be made. And I know I shared with you before the show before we went live that I just went to Peru for 2 weeks and did some ayahuasca ceremonies. And, you know, people go to Peru, they do they do the ayahuasca ceremonies, or, you know, people do 5-MeO DMT or smoke DMT or any kind of psychedelic experience at a high enough dose, they tap into that collective consciousness. You know, they'll come back from it talking about oneness, talking about the earth, and understanding how everything truly, truly is interconnected. And so what I've got to say is, on some level, none of this political crap matters. You know, it's like it matters on a very superficial human level. But if we take it to like cosmically what's going on, or what's going on with the earth, this is just the humans basically playing their Monopoly game.
Yeah.
But on such a massive scale that it affects lives. It affects whether Susie in the inner city of Chicago eats or not.
Right.
And until we, as a human race, decide that it shouldn't be that way, it's probably going to remain that way.
Right. And I think that's happening. So on the power and money side of things, one of the things that fascinates me is like the whole story of the Fed, the Federal Reserve Bank, right? I don't know how familiar we are with that, but basically the Fed is not a government institution. It's a private company owned by the big banks, and that the company has given the right to print money on behalf of the company.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent to me of magic beans.
Yeah.
I mean, and so is Bitcoin. And like I mean, I'm not smart enough to understand all of that. I did know about the Fed and it not being like it's its own privately held thing. I did know that. Now, whether I understand it or not, I don't.
Right, but so part of this is this book that I read called The Creature from Jekyll Island, which is all like the creature from Jekyll Island is the Fed, because it was created in 1913 after a secret meeting on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia, I think. But then the idea basically is that the Fed, the banks behind the Fed, make money when they print more money, because they print the money out of nothing and then they collect the interest on it. And so the more they can get governments to spend more money than they have, the more money they make. So now we're in, the U.S. has $21 trillion in debt. That's great. What they found was, like, initially the best way to get governments to spend more money than they have to is through wars. So they would basically instigate, according to this book, bankers instigated First World War, Second World War, actually American Civil War as well. The Russian Revolution in 17, like all that was was organized basically by bankers. Then eventually they found out that wars, leave dead people, and people get tired of that and stuff. So they came up with this global warming thing, climate change thing, as like there's an excuse to make governments spend trillions and trillions of dollars with no dead people, with no wars. So that's I don't know how much of that is true. A lot of it seems to make sense, but so I'm really like climate change healing plan is something that I'm totally with you on. Like it seems bizarre. It seems that we've so lost that sense, like that sixth sense, that sense of like nature and like what works for humans and healing and all kinds of things, right?
We have lost that, and we've lost it because we're not connected to our planet.
And we're not connected to our own inner being, right?
So let me just say it this way, and I'm just learning a little bit of that of this. But I believe, and this is a personal belief, I've researched it some. There is research to back it up, that people a long time ago had a different brain chemistry. And when I talk about brain chemistry, which I cover in chapter 3 of my book, that really talks about like our emotional states are developed by which chemicals are like running through our system. So how much dopamine, how much serotonin, how much norepinephrine, how much oxytocin, how much vasopressin, all of these chemicals. And like we're really living in a stress-based state where we have a lot of cortisol and adrenaline, right? We run on cortisol and adrenaline, and we drink coffee, and that pumps us up pumps us up even more. It's like,
Yeah.
so we're living in this stressed state. Okay. Well, our brain functions a certain way in a stressed state, and our brain functions a different way in a relaxed state. So now again, this is my personal belief. This isn't even in my book, but I believe that people a long time ago, and I mean thousands of years ago, that they had a different chemical balance than what we have. And I believe that this chemical balance that they had was one that allowed them to be more conscious, more enlightened than we currently are today. And I think that that is why, and there are some people that support this theory, that maybe they had a higher elevation of like DMT in their system than what we do now. But this is why they understood nature. This is why they understood they understood a connection to the earth on a higher level than we do now. Because, by the way, like before Central America was colonized by England, the Native Americans were doing just fine.
Right. Yeah.
They were doing just fine, and they didn't have the reserve bank.
They were pretty well connected with nature and with themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, and so were a lot of like Mesoamerican cultures of that time, like the Mayans, the Incas, even in Egypt and in the Dogon tribes. I mean, there's just so much of this throughout antiquity that shows us that they were connected. I mean, in Hinduism, all of that symbolism is there, and somehow we've lost that. Now we are more disconnected than ever because, and especially like the younger generation, they're more into their smart devices than into connecting with each other. Now, I'm not saying that that's a bad thing, because there's good and there's bad to it, because it also connects them with the rest of the world, which is amazing, right? But it's like, what is it doing to the human body? How is it changing our chemicals? How is it changing our alignment? Because when that alignment in our spine starts to change, that actually also changes the chemicals that we produce as well. So we're meant to be in a homeostatic state of alignment. And it can be difficult when we've got so much distractions. And then people talk about like the pineal gland and how our diet is really
in the water, right?
And those are like, so like, here's the thing. We start talking about that stuff and the reserve bank and all of this stuff. It's like borderline conspiracy theory. And that's just a place that I just can't spend time there, because it's frustrating for me. And it can leads to rabbit holes, right? But your personal development, understanding like what can you do to control your own reality? What can you do? Because every time that you're working on healing yourself, every time you're working on becoming that best version of yourself, there is some sort of mystical, synchronistic ripple effect with that, because by you becoming better, that ripples around just like it did with the monkeys. Okay, so like my whole thing is, how do I become the best version of Mary Shores? And then let that be the thing that radiates out and connects me with other people on my same frequency. And also like the things that I see my kids doing, like seeing how that influences my kids. I just, right as soon as I got back from Peru, I took my kid to a Tony Robbins event, and he did the whole like walk on fire thing. And, it was very symbolic for him, because we don't really have those rites of passages anymore.
Right. How old is he?
He actually just turned 17 on Sunday.
All right, very cool. Congratulations. Yeah. So tell me about the ayahuasca. What was that experience like? It's on my list of things I'd love to try one day.
Yeah. Well, if you're called to it, I think that the first thing about ayahuasca is, if you're called to it, begin to do your research and figure out where you want to go and what capacity you want to do it and what your intentions are for doing it. Mine was very clear that I was looking for healing from some traumas that have happened in my past. Like I've already mentioned about my daughter passing away and being on my own at 16. These were all traumatic experiences to deal with at a young age, when I wasn't even really fully an adult yet. So also there's this part of me that I'd always wanted to be an anthropologist. So I got, I had a resort approach me about hosting a retreat there And I thought, well, if I'm going to go do that, I need to go do ayahuasca with the indigenous people in Peru. So I started watching documentaries, and I found a guy named Rak Razam who was leading a retreat in Peru at a healing center called DAS, that's DAS. And the curandero there is Percy Garcia. Now, I swear to God, this man must be an ascended master. I mean, he was so incredible. This Percy Garcia, he's like, we would call him a shaman, but he calls himself, or he considers himself to be a curandero. So you go there, there's literally like no creature comforts. So you get dropped off on the side of a road. So you go to Iquitos, Peru, you get dropped off on a side of a road, then you hike 4 miles through the jungle to get to this healing center. Now here's all the Westerners with like big luggage and all this stuff, and you've got the children in the village carrying the luggage for them, and you pay them money and they're all happy, and that's great. But you get there and there's no electricity, there's no running water, there's just nothing that like me living in the Midwest is used to. So I got to stay in this hut. It was great. It was like a hut built on stilts, and I had a candle in my room. I had a bed with a mosquito net. I did have a toilet, and the way to flush it was you had to dump water in it. So we had a giant garbage pail of river water that we would use to flush the toilets. So that was that, and they feed you amazing food that's all natural, and it goes according to a dieta. So whenever you do ayahuasca, the recommendation is that you follow a certain diet or a dieta. So this looks like no salt, no pork, no sugar, no sex or masturbation for a certain period of time before you're going to do your ceremony. And they really don't want you to have like red meat either. There's certain foods that are going to interact with the tyramines or something in the ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a tea that is made out of the ayahuasca vine that is pretty plentiful in the Amazonian rainforest, and as well as DMT, or a leaf that contains DMT, which I think comes from the chacruna leaves, but I could have that wrong. It's in more than one plant, but depending on where you go, they're going to use whatever leaf they want. So they cook this brew. They do it in a very specific recipe, and they cook it for about 24 hours before you're going to have your ceremony. And then it tastes terrible. It tastes like Graham Hancock described it as tasting like a ground up toad. So I wouldn't describe it as that terrible, but it was very different tasting, very very strong tasting. And then about an hour later, you really start to go into your experience. And so for me, it looked like a full body paralysis that was followed up with a full body sense of vibration. And then I went on to some other dimension where I had a complete some type of near-death experience. It's kind of hard to put it into words other than to say that I died 1,000 times. My body disintegrated, all the molecules in my body disintegrated and floated off into the jungle. And if you hear meditators talk about becoming like a drop in the ocean, I experienced that. I experienced interconnection with the entire world and cosmos. I went so far, I went so many dimensions away from here that literally the concept of human no longer existed. So it was the best thing I can describe is saying something like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So you know how you go through the different Bordeaux's? I think there's 7 different Bordeaux's that they want you to go through, and they guide you through that. So it was like that. I would go to one realm, and then another, and then another, and then another, until I got so far that human no longer was a thing. So what do you think?
That's what do I think? It sounds enticing. Yeah. It
sounds enticing to die and go 7 dimensions away.
Exactly.
What is the point of it? It's all right, because that doesn't sound pleasant to do that. But when I started coming back, I was given a choice about whether to come back or not. And when I started to come back, that was a different experience, coming back through the dimensions, because I saw you see these visions, and I saw all the bioplasmic streamers coming off of the human body, and I could feel the emotions. Like I could feel other people suffering. Whoever I would tune into, someone's consciousness, I could feel their emotions. Whether it was grief, whether it was suffering, whether it was happiness, whether it was love, I could feel all of their emotions. And I was shown how thoughts turn into matter. And I went through a period where I was shown all the gifts that I chose to have in this lifetime, and that I was shown that I was given this universal knowledge. Like when we started off the show talking about how I wanted to write this book, but I had this limiting belief. Well, I was shown that really is true, that I was born with this universal knowledge, and that I had asked for that. So I had set an intention before I was even born that this was going to be what I was going to focus on in this lifetime. So for that reason, it was really an incredible experience. It wasn't like Disney World. I'm not going to say it was fun, but it was enlightening for sure.
Mm-hmm. So how many days were you there for?
Well, I was actually at the retreat center for 10 days, and we did 5 ceremonies during that time.
Okay. All right. That was a long one.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, sounds incredible. Are you happy you went?
Oh, absolutely. And each of the ceremonies, each of the experiences were very different. So I had another, so that one was the symbolic ego death. So people that take psychedelics, if they take enough of them, they'll go through this ego death. And so the whole near-death experience is symbolic of having the ego death. And I believe that this is the thing that when you are, there's some great videos about ayahuasca and how it rewires your neural pathways, which is what I'm into from a scientific standpoint. And I can tell you that, it's just very fresh for me, but I can tell that something is different in my mind, and that all of that monkey mind or that mind chatter, it's just gone. So that constant thinking process that I typically go through is just gone, and my mind is much quieter. And so I do feel like there's been a rewiring or repatterning of the neural pathways. And then in another one of the ceremonies, I went through a very somatic, releasing of traumas that was very physical. And that, I believe, because I'm a big believer that trauma is not necessarily about what happened to you. So trauma isn't the fact that my daughter died, or that I was out on my own at 16, or that someone was abused either sexually, mentally, or physically. But trauma is about how it shows up in your present day reality. Because we have a structure of DNA, and I love one of the best explanations that I've seen on this is with Dr. Joseph Tafur. He's an MD. He wrote a book called The Fellowship of the River. He's an MD. He talks about becoming a shaman. After he was an MD, he became a shaman. So when he was going through his shamanic training, you take the ayahuasca, and that's the way that you learn from the ayahuasca. The plant teaches you what you need to know in and of itself, which to the Western mind is really strange to hear. Jeremy Narby wrote a really great book about it. He's an anthropologist that was studying the shamanism, the Amazonian shamans, and said, what if we just take them at their word? So that's an incredible question. What if we just take them at their word? Then we can understand that they're telling what they're actually seeing instead of trying to make it symbolic. So anyway, Dr. Joseph Tafur talks about the DNA. And he would see, when he was in his ayahuasca ceremonies, he would see these dragons go in and attach themselves to the DNA. Now, this is fascinating because the dragons are the trauma. So say when you're 5 years old, you're abused. Then that actually goes in to your DNA, and the trauma lodges into your DNA. Now, we know about this in science. We call it epigenetics. Okay, so the epigenetics is the gene expression of the DNA structure. So when you have trauma, what it does is it alters the way that certain genes express themselves. So that when you grow up, we know that these traumatic experiences lead to disease later on in the body. And we know now that we have this epidemic of certain mystery illnesses, Crohn's disease, fibromyalgia, autoimmune, MS, Parkinson's, all of these things are on the rise. And my belief, and this is being studied by science now, is that these traumatic events that are happening in our lives that are not dealt with because we repress them. All right, we repress them. That keeps it lodged in our DNA, which changes our gene expression. So when you go through a releasing of the trauma, have you ever been out in the woods and you see those little sticky seeds that have the spikes? Mm-hmm. They might be called cockaburls, and they like stick on your clothes. Mm-hmm. And you walk through, like if you walk through a bush of them, you'll have them stuck all over your clothes. Yeah. Well, imagine that's like the dragons. That's like the traumas that get stuck. So when you've heard spiritual teachers say the issues are in the tissues, our bodies truly are like libraries, and they store everything that happens to us. So those are things that are stuck in our DNA. And when I went through this traumatic, when I went through this somatic release experience through this ceremony, what happened was all of those cockaburls shook off of my DNA. Okay, it all just came off. And, when they talk about ayahuasca, they'll talk about a purge. They'll talk about the purging experience. So it would be like some kind of trauma or something from my past. I would re-experience it. It would be very, very painful. And then you would have the purge, which is not pleasant. But the whole thing, when you go through hours of this somatic release, it's just really incredible because you can literally feel the trauma leaving your body. I know you had no idea we were going to talk about any of this today, so
yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. I definitely want to check this out and get that book, man. Like I said, it's been on my list for a while to try. This has just made it more real for me, so that's great. Thanks for that.
If you're called to it, I definitely recommend it. But again, you want to do your research, because just with all things, there's the good and the bad and the in between. Mm-hmm. And there's definitely healing centers that are not reputable. They're just like anything, just like anything in life. There's good places and there's not so good places.
All right. Can you make an introduction for me?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely.
That would be amazing. And some resources and things to study. I have looked into some things in the past, and then like got sidetracked and shit happened, and I never got acted on it. So.
Well, I studied it for 6 years. Mm-hmm. Before I actually did it. So.
All right. I'm on track.
I think the more, and I'm not suggesting you have to study for 6 years, but I'm kind of the type of person that I want to know everything inside, outside, backwards, and forwards before I even dip my toe in the possibility that something could happen. Because, I still have 2 minor children. Mm-hmm. And I'm a single mom. So, like that changes my choices in life, because I want to make sure that I am going to be able to come back to them in one piece and still be their mom.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like a good idea. Yeah. All right. So, so if you could leave people here with a message to people as individuals in their own life, I think we've talked a lot about that. But if you could like summarize it to like one thing, the one thing that you want people to leave with here.
It would be that, and this is directly like the core message of my book, is that everything you do, everything you say, every word that comes out of your mouth, every action you take, every choice you make in the thinnest sliced moments of life is either creating a deeper connection to what you want, or it's driving a disconnection. It is really that simple, that every choice in every moment is either connecting you or disconnecting you. It's just that simple.
I like that. What was it you wrote in your book? You were like, is it gonna something or clog?
Cleanse or clog. So it's this concept of cleanse or clog, which really just means connect or disconnect. Right. That like every choice you're making is either cleansing you or clogging you.
I like that. It's a very simple way to look at it, and it's very practical, very, very applicable. All right. Then if you were to sum up like your what's the one for people who are politically engaged, whether they're actual politicians or people who are like trying to work on improving society somehow from their perspective? What would you be like your one takeaway for those types?
For people that actually work in politics?
People who are working in actively, like active politicians, what would you say to our senators or president, whatever, or people who are politically engaged somehow? Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would ask them to remember the original intention of politics was it to be an act of service. And I didn't tell you this, but I come from a political family. My maiden name is Giuliani. So,
oh. so you're in fact related to our former mayor here in New York.
Yeah, but it's my brother is the one that's much more political than I am, because I actually used to be so obsessed with politics that I would make myself physically sick. Like the whole hanging Chad thing, I don't know how I didn't have a heart attack that day. Right. But so I had to actually remove myself from politics years and years ago. And I'm glad that I did. But my brother's still involved, and if you ever hear of another Giuliani running for office, that will be my brother. So
what's his name?
His name is Anthony Giuliani.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that sounds interesting. So like, it's my background is like I've always been interested in politics, but only in the sense of like it's been in the back of my mind to be like, how would I design a country if I were to like create a new country? I'm the one writing the Constitution and the laws. What would it look like, right? Because it seems to me like so many of the laws that we have are just stupid. Like,
they are stupid.
War on drugs, like crazy. Immigration laws, just absurd. At every level.
Did I hear that Trump is coming down on breastfeeding now? I mean,
I haven't heard that.
I saw some stories on it, on Facebook, so that makes it true.
Yeah. Okay.
But something my brother told me years ago. And I've actually remembered this, and it's been a good, impactful thing to remember, that most of the things that we get told in the media about politics are created for distraction, so that we're focused on something that is a distraction from what they're really trying to work on. So like whether it's about abortion or whether it's gay rights or whether it's whatever is going on in the superficial level of media that everyone is getting like level 10 up in arms over, that is created as a distraction, so that behind the scenes they're really working on something else that we don't even know about. And the other thing I will say is, Trump just had this meeting, this very historical, significant meeting with North Korean dictator, correct? And I think that and I'm not for Trump and I'm not against Trump, but I definitely notice there's a lot of Trump bashing that goes on in the media. And I don't care, like whatever, they do it, they're just doing that to make money. So they can do that. But the reality is that Trump had this meeting that is historical significance, that he had this meeting, and that if something works out as a result of that meeting with North Korea, that is going to pivot the world in a direction that we very much need to go. And so I feel like at the end of the day, if we do more focusing on what is working, that's going to serve us ultimately. I also believe, and this is just again a personal belief, that the United States is a tribe, but the larger that tribes get, the harder they are to manage. Just like with business. My business, I've got 20 employees. That's very simple to manage, because you try to make rules that fit everybody, and the bigger that population gets, the harder that gets to manage. And so, there's a tribe, I think this tribe's in Africa called the Pygmy tribe. It's one of the last indigenous tribes that was found, and these people have just an incredible society that is untouched by government, but their people are happy. There's no word for crime. They have no crime. They have no sexual molestation. They have no theft. They have no physical abuse, domestic abuse. They have no rape. They literally are like one of the last pure indigenous cultures where their society looks so different than ours, and they're doing things in a completely different way.
You said Yes. I've seen other examples of that too. You were saying about the like focus on what's working, which I think is like absolutely true and brilliant, and like pretty much the complete opposite of what happens most of the time in politics and the media, right? And the other thing that I've noticed is like if you focus on what you want, it turns out like if you look at like we don't want a lot of people to be poor. We don't. Like everybody agrees on that, right? We don't want people to get murdered and shot. We especially not kids in schools, but generally like everybody agrees on that. Everybody agrees that we don't want the earth to heat up to like, by 100 degrees and we all die. Everybody agrees on that. If you focus on what we actually want, it turns out pretty much everybody agrees, more or less.
You're right.
But then we just start to argue a lot about how to do it, but nobody actually looks at like, what evidence do we have that this actually works? Like whatever the policy is, right? It doesn't seem to be happening in the conversation.
Well, personally, I feel like as we're going through this paradigm shift, I feel like the next up and coming generations are going to be the ones, because these kids are brilliant. Mm-hmm. I mean, these kids are brilliant on another level. And when I saw the TED talk of the kid that created the equipment that can clean all the little plastic particles out of the ocean within 5 years. Mm-hmm. I mean, and then you look at people like Elon Musk and what they're doing in the world, like those are the things that are going to solve the world's problems. And I don't know anything about global warming. I guess my personal opinion on global warming is that it's a natural phenomenon, and I think it's funny that we think we affect that so much. But if you look at throughout the history of the Earth, there's definitely periods of climate change. That's just part of the seasons of the solar system. I mean, it just has to be that way. We don't get to control to keep it at this nice, comfy temperature for ourselves, but that the bigger problem is the trash, the pollution, and the toxic environment that we're all living in that is increasing the instance of autism, Parkinson's, MS. I mean, all of these are nervous system disorders that are directly related to how our bodies cannot handle this toxic environment that we're living in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my take on that and global warming is basically like if you're altering the composition of the atmosphere dramatically, that's unprovable. We have no idea what the consequences might be. We try to make models, but they're like very, very simplistic. You basically can't model this effectively. But it seems to me there's plenty of promising technologies to suck some of that CO2 out of the air.
There really is. And you know what?
And it's not that hard.
We're going to be okay.
We're going to be right.
We're going to be okay.
But what's fascinating is there's so much interest in these like Paris Climate Agreement Accord and all that shit, which seems like it costs trillions and trillions of dollars and makes very, very little difference. And there is not a lot of interest in the technologies that would actually solve the CO2 issue.
Probably, and I don't know about that, but I'll tell you what, there is an excellent documentary. It is called Trashed, and I think you would like it, because it really brings to light more the toxic load that we're putting on. It's not about the climate thing, right, but it's about the toxic load, and it really talks about how when these toxins like seep out into the soils and get into the soil, which gets into the water, which gets into the plants, which gets into all the food that we eat, and now that we're like the third and fourth generation out from this trash problem, how we're seeing the rates of certain things like autism go through the roof. Right. So, and how the woman's body is like a sponge that's going to use the pregnancy period because that pregnancy is like soaking up all those toxins out of her body.
Right. My dad is always talking about how like back in the day, chickens actually tasted like something, but like nobody knows because nobody eats a chicken that was born more than 3 months ago, right? So like over a generation or two, it's just like, all right, this is what chicken tastes like now. We have no idea what it was like. You can't go back and compare. But our food and our nutrition is hurting.
All right, and so here's the best advice we can give people. Don't eat Kentucky Fried Chicken. What is the other one? Long John Silver's or McDonald's.
Yes. All right, so I'm gonna let's sign off. You got to be somewhere else.
Yep, I got another show in just a few minutes.
What do you like? Where do people find out about you? And what do you got for them? You got your book. Hey. I'm obviously gonna link to your book, your website, all that stuff.
Yeah, here's the book right here, Conscious Communications,
Yay.
Which is your step-by-step guide to harnessing the power of your words to change your mind, your choices, and your life. This book is definitely chocked full of one chapter after another that builds on the other, and it's got some really great reviews. So my ask is that if you go on Amazon, check out Conscious Communications, read the description and some reviews, you'll know whether you're interested in it or not. If you want to connect with me, a great place to do that is either on Facebook or LinkedIn, the name Mary Shores, and also I have a Facebook group called Fearless Ambition. So, and of course I have a website, maryshores.com. We've got a free giveaway that is our Daily Desires Diary journal page. So I'll let Calvin link that up for the show.
I will do that. All right. Thank you so much, Mary. It was really a pleasure to meet with you. I hope that I can get you back someday.
Yeah, that'd be really fun.
And we can dive more into this. I feel like there's so much here to learn from you. So thank you very much. It was truly a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, you as well. Thanks, Calvin.
Have an amazing day. Bye.